Mark and Luke, they weren't apostles. So why did they get to write gospels? It's an interesting and good question. Here's something about Mark and Luke that makes them unique. So obviously Matthew and John were apostles. They were two of the 12. They were with Jesus throughout his whole ministry. Luke doesn't show up until halfway through the book of Acts. Over halfway through the book of Acts. It's not until Paul's second missionary journey. Is it chapter 16 at the very beginning, or is it the very end of I'm on the right chapter there. It would be Mark. What's funny, in Acts 15, John Mark, the Gospel of Mark writer, he leaves and abandons them. And then in chapter 16, we see the pronouns change from they to we because Luke joins the team. And that's how you find when Luke is with Paul. And through the rest of the book of Acts, if they're speaking of third person away, Luke is not with them. And then all of a sudden you'll see it says we. It's because Luke's with them again. And so you'll see Luke actually, but Luke never mentions himself, but other than when the pronouns change. So all that said though, John Mark, who was he and why did he get to write a gospel? In the Gospel of Mark, there's only one specific detail that you can learn that you can't get anywhere else. And that is that a young naked boy ran away from the Garden of Gethsemane on the night that Jesus was arrested. And the early church tradition was he was that young naked boy. And that's why he included that part, because that's his addition to the story. We find out that when Peter is in prison, they're praying for him at Maria, his mother's house, John Mark's house. And there is a tradition that the same house that they prayed at for Peter is the same house that the day of Pentecost was, and the same house the Last Supper was held in. That when they reserved that upper room, they got a large, spacious room, 120 people on the day of Pentecost, so it was a big room. I mean, this size, right? 120 people can fit in here if you really want to pack the house, right? But it's like, and they gathered there, and they kind of set up a home base there. And so after the crucifixion, they continued staying there. That's a tradition. It's not in the Bible. We know that it's the house from Peter later in Acts when Peter's in prison, and then he goes there and the whole thing with Rhoda and slamming the door on him, that story. And so, but if that's true, it does make sense because then Mark would have lived there during the Last Supper. And Mark probably was helping serve and do stuff in the background. He would have been about 13, 14 years old, 15 years old. He was a young boy. And don't tell a 15-year-old that's young, grown adult. But when they left to go down to the Garden of Gethsemane, maybe he was ready for bed. And so what does he do? It talked about how he only basically had like a loose thing thrown around him, kind of like a real makeshift toga. And so if he followed them, where's Jesus going? This is interesting. So he gets dressed and he goes to follow. And then it says that when the soldiers come, they grab his clothes, he rips the toga or whatever, the sheet off, and he runs off naked. There's John Mark. Early church tradition is that Mark would then later go with Barnabas and Paul and start the first missionary journey, but then he bails early on. And on the second missionary journey, Acts 15, when they go to take off, we know that Mark and Barnabas are related. They're like probably uncle and nephew, could be cousins. It's the word is kind of an ambiguous word that can mean a relationship in that range. And Barnabas says, I want Mark, and Paul says, no. He bailed on us last time, I'm not taking him again. And so they have a fight. Could you believe it? Christians have fights? And they split, church split. Barnabas takes Mark and goes one way. Paul takes Silas and goes another way. But with that said, by the end of Paul's ministry, he says, hey, Mark's useful to me. Send him to me. By his last letter, he's saying, no, Mark's a useful guy. He's built up a testimony. Many years have gone by now. And Mark traditionally became like the sidekick to Peter. And so this is, again, church tradition. But it's from the early church fathers. It's not like a tradition that started way, way late. We're talking like the people. The church has lots of writers that came out in the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century. I like the Ante-Nicene fathers, basically the Council of Nicaea, people before that. And I just like those guys because they're the closest you can get to the apostles. And they talked about how Mark traveled with Peter. And so many people say actually that the Gospel of Mark in some ways is like a Gospel of Peter, because Mark probably got most of his information from Peter while he was spending time with Peter and traveling. that said, I'll spend less time on Dr. Luke. Luke wrote Luke and Acts. He got saved with Paul in Philippi. It was Macedonia. He goes over there and he finds Luke. Luke starts traveling with Paul. When Paul gets arrested, he spends multiple years in Caesarea. During that time is when people believe Luke then went and found the apostles and started asking them questions. Luke was a doctor. He was into details. His gospel is more detail-oriented. You know, when someone says he healed a hand, Luke says it's the right hand. I mean, he always got the little details in there because he was a doctor. And Luke went and interviewed Mary. And that's why Luke's the only one who really has the birth story of Jesus. Matthew gets a little bit of the story, like Gabriel talking to Joseph and then the wise men a couple years later. He doesn't get any of the main stuff that Luke gets for us. And so Luke's the only one who tells us about Zacharias and John the Baptist, and Luke has some unique stuff. And so Luke basically just went around and he interviewed people. And he held a very revered role in the early church, though he wasn't one of the apostles. And so there you got two guys. So in some ways, people say Luke's gospel could be called the Gospel of Paul because he had a lot of Paul influence, but Paul wasn't there for the time of Jesus. So that was him interviewing the other apostles, getting their stories from them as their accounts, and then putting it all together. He made the Gospel of Luke.